This is Duke University.
All black, everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are on location here in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Harvard University, specifically the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute. We're being hosted today by the Hiphop Archive here at the Du Bois Institute. And I am joined on my right by author and journalist Diane McWhorter. And let me just say this, because I've never had the chance to say this on Left of Black, Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist Diane McWhorter, who won Pulitzer Prize for her nonfiction for the book Carry Me Home, which of course talked about life in Alabama. And you are definitely a daughter of Alabama, and Alabama doesn't leave you even when you talk.
2 words, roll tide.
Roll tide.
Yeah.
How are you doing today?
Good. That's what we can remain proud of over the decades. Yeah.
Diane is a fellow here at the Du Bois Institute, and tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing here.
The book I'm doing now is that my first book, Carry Me Home, was about the Civil Rights Revolution in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And now I'm moving 90 miles up the road to Huntsville, Alabama, where at the same time that the events that I talked about in Carry Me Home, George Wallace, Bull Connor, all that was going on, the former Nazis, Hitler's top rocket scientists, were building the rocket that eventually got us to the moon. So we're winning the Cold War in Alabama at the time that the white people are losing the revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
at home. Yeah. So it's rich.
I mean, there's an element of your work, Diane, and let me just put it out there this way. For those of us who teach Black studies.
Yeah. I'm bracing myself.
We'll have classes, and sometimes there'll be 2 or 3 white kids in the class, right?
Yeah.
And the Black kids sometimes don't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
Right? Why are these white kids in the class?
Yeah.
And what I've always said throughout my career is that it's always important to have non-Black students in these classes, because those students become witnesses, right, to some sort of truth or certain kind of truths, that when they're in another classroom where there's no one else that's Black, they get the chance to kind of articulate this truth. And much of your work is about really, as a white woman, bearing witness to what this landscape is like in terms of race and civil rights.
Right. I infiltrated the white world.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering what it's been like having to navigate this, right? And on a high level, right? In a very visible level.
Well, Fred Shuttlesworth, who's the hero in my book, he was the civil rights leader in Birmingham and was one of Martin Luther King's top lieutenants, and really kind of forced him to come to Birmingham and ultimately that put the movement over, really.
Right,
and he used to always say that he didn't expect white people to get out and demonstrate at the time because they would have rendered themselves ineffective. So he said that the job of white people at the time, good white people who wanted to, who were troubled by the status quo then, was to educate other white people. So I always keep that in mind, that it's not like I'm trying to be I'm not trying to be a what shall I say? I'm not trying to be anything other than who I am. But but I do know white people, and I know how they think, and so when I can explain that, then then I think I've done a service.
We're here with Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist Diane McWhorter, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her book Carry Me Home. We are here at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University, where Diane is a fellow this year. You did an amazing piece in the New York Times marking the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Talk a little bit about what Birmingham is like now in relation to that 50th anniversary, and particularly the significance of what has come to be known as the fifth little girl. Right.
Well, a couple of years before 2013, Birmingham started gearing up for this commemoration, and I knew it was going to be really tricky for them to negotiate this, because on one hand, they wanted to celebrate the movement that was really, reached its kind of prime in Birmingham. But on the other hand, the reason that happened was because police dogs and fire hoses were turned on child demonstrators. And then in this really gruesome mirror image of what that was called the children's miracle, because they finally filled the jails, achieved the Gandhian goal of filling jails so that it really sort of shut down the usual way of doing things in Birmingham, the way of dealing with civil unrest as they considered it, and then the gruesome mirror image of that was the church bombing in the fall, where 4 children were killed, and so I remember thinking that that the city government, which is predominantly black now, was going to have to sell this as this big economic chance in order to get the business community behind it. And I could just kind of see it coming. So in 2011, I was down in Birmingham and I addressed the Rotary Club. And I'd been thinking, they want to do something. They want to participate. Right. So I had been thinking for a few years, I had been actually thinking that there needed to be some kind of foundation or fund that would help out people who had paid a price, sometimes a very high price, and had fallen on hard times at the end of their lives, or were just facing end-of-life issues that we all will face, probably. Right. Yeah. Right. So there were 2 categories I saw. One were people who'd been victims of civil rights crimes, like Sarah Collins, the 5th girl in the 16th Street Baptist Church basement at the time, who did survive the bombing. Her sister died, but she survived, was blinded in one eye, just never got any acknowledgement, really. Right. And then the other category would be people like Fred Shuttlesworth, the civil rights leader, who was facing a lot of health issues at the end, and he wasn't indigent or anything, but he was just barely scraping by with his medical expenses. So anyway, so everybody seemed really on board with this, and I had these great follow-up conversations with people, and everybody got hung up on how to define eligibility. And I remember thinking, if this thing gets big enough to be gamed, then then it has worked, But let's don't get ahead of ourselves. So anyway, so honestly, what happened was I didn't have the time or the skills, frankly, to be able to put this together. And I had talked to the executive director of the Jazz Foundation of America, which had a very good template for this. And I really needed to hand it off to have somebody just start doing it. And in the meantime, the state of Alabama legislature, the first Republican legislature since Reconstruction, passed the so-called immigration law, which, to my mind, reinvented Jim Crow as Juan Crow. It was like targeting Hispanic immigrants. And I just thought, I thought if the business community could not stop this, they can't do this. So
that inability to see those links, right?
I know.
I mean, that's the thing that's really frustrating. That just the inability, the same hand that can admit we made a mistake here will then reproduce the same mistake 3 generations later and not see the connection.
And that everybody was wanting to be able to pat themselves on the back for how far we had come 50 years later. And I thought, really? We can still do this. So that just really broke my heart, actually. And I remember talking to somebody who said, an enlightened businessman who said that he had talked to the legislator behind that, Scott Beeson, who was lived in Birmingham, and he said that well, all my constituents are for this. They believe in this, and I said, well, his constituents would probably also be in favor of shipping black people back to Africa. That doesn't mean it's right or it's constitutional. You know what I mean? So what does that have to do with anything? So that was kind of the thinking. It was almost like, we can do this, so we will. That was kind of the standard.
It's interesting because I would probably suggest that, the piece that you did in the Times talking about Sarah Collins, and she shows up on Democracy Now! The next day. in an interview, and I just recently saw there's an Indiegogo campaign of crowdfunding. To retire Sarah Collins, right? And so I think the importance of these kind of stories and narratives is that it really does force people to pay attention to the folks who get lost.
Yeah.
In these narratives.
Yeah.
And I think and you know this better than anything. I mean, so much of the success of that movement were the people who we don't know their names. Who weren't going to join an organization necessarily, but found their little piece of the world to be able to protest.
Yeah.
And kind of move things forward.
Yeah. And the other thing that kind of troubled me and really interested me when I was doing my book was the definition of innocence. Okay, so you notice that the victims are always insistently called the four little girls. That's the name of Spike Lee's movie.
Right.
It was the subtext of the Congressional Gold Medal that was given to them. It was like these poor, Nancy Pelosi referred to them as these babes,
Right.
And I remember thinking, when during one of the trials, when I saw Denise McNair's shoes, which were being, they tried to get them put into evidence, did not succeed, as I recall. They allowed the piece of mortar that was in her head, but would not allow the shoes. The judge, yeah. So, and I remember looking at the shoes, thinking how big they were. And Denise was the youngest of them. She was 11. And the other three were 14. And I remember thinking, I was my full size at 14. So they were not little.
Right.
And I remember thinking, why do they have to have been little in order to qualify as being innocent enough?
Victims, right?
Yeah,
in
and victims.
Some sort of way.
And even when it happened, and there was a sort of national shock over this, even mainstream outlets like the networks, who would not be conservative or enemies of the movement, had to establish that the girls had never demonstrated. Because interestingly, 16th Street Baptist was a very bourgeois church.
Right.
It was one of the it was the privileged, and and as some of your viewers may not know, the black middle class was very late to get behind the movement.
Right. Meanwhile, Shuttlesworth, that was a different.
Yeah, Shuttlesworth.
More working class, right?
Yeah, and Shuttlesworth's followers, so-called, were kind of rejected by the black middle classes, because they were the masses. Okay. And so 16th Street Baptist was very strategically located next to Kelly Ingram Park, where the demonstrations took place. But they didn't. But the church was, by and large, did not support it, the movement. So so it was really not that surprising that these four girls had not demonstrated during the spring. Yeah. And a lot of people didn't want their kids. A lot of adults didn't want their kids to demonstrate, whether they were middle class or not. Honestly, and the movement knew that the surest way to get the parents involved would be for their kids to be in jail. So it was very smart for them to do that. So anyway, I just kind of looked at how we define worthy victims and innocence, and how, and by the same token, in this kind of American myth of unbroken progress, we want sometimes the casualties do not satisfy the conditions of people. They've suffered, and they bear all the marks of that.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, but the mark of a society is our ability, to take care of them. And in the piece, I tried to. I kind of kept it on the casualties of this history, and the children who continue to be victims of that, and not just the people who give their lives, like Trayvon Martin, but also the people who are more likely to go to jail than to college. Those are also casualties of this history. Yeah. So it's the children are suffering, and if we can't somehow get behind addressing that, then what are we as a society? Yeah.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here on location in Cambridge, Massachusetts at Harvard University, specifically the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute. We are here with Diane McWhorter, who is an Institute Fellow, Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist. So I'm going to ask you a big question.
Yeah.
Your work is deep up in it,
Okay, thank you.
You, like everybody else, have lived through the first 6.5 years of the Obama presidency.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think President Obama has navigated the issue of race, whether in terms of the real-time lived experience of race, Trayvon Martin, et cetera, or his historical connections to the realities of race that, that no one disputes helped make him,
Mm-hmm.
the first Black president?
Yeah. Well, I've written critically about him, and partly it's to I'm not a politician,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I understand everything. I understand why he acts the way he does on race, and there's an explanation for everything, but but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be said.
Right.
And so, for example, the thing that really got me was the Shirley Sherrod thing, and I remember. Just to remind people, she was the agricultural department employee who Andrew Breitbart misrepresented.
Right.
In fact, he represented her as the opposite
of
what she was doing.
Right.
Yeah. So, and she was fired from her job prematurely, obviously. And then when Obama addressed this, he said he blamed it on the internet, YouTube, and I thought, well, I can understand why you may not want to really engage with this, but at least don't say what it isn't.
Right.
Don't say
Right.
it is.
Right. Say what it is.
Just
right.
say what it is, and it was race baiting and
Right.
and racism. So what I've noticed, both with the commemoration of Birmingham and with Obama's responses to Trayvon, for example, is that we are more comfortable seeing all this in terms of Black suffering than in terms of what the sort of institutional choices and behaviors that led up to it. So I really thought Obama did a good job of explaining to the country that it wasn't Trayvon's hoodie that made him a mark. It was the color of his skin, because even Black men in suits like him get the same response. Right. So I thought that was good. But my friend Ed Pavlich, who was a fellow here last year,
good friend of mine also.
Is he?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So he pointed out to me that Obama, as a citizen of Chicago, had a perfect opportunity to point out that there was there had just been this case in a police brutality and torture, where the police chief was arrested in his hometown, where he could have sort of talked about this on an institutional basis, and as in terms of who does this, the white people really. And so what I noticed in Birmingham with the church bombing is you see over and over what you heard over and over again, that was that these children were killed by hatred. And what my book is about is that the church bombing was this inevitable outcome of history, and not only, and the ringleader of the bombers had actually been protected by City Hall for years. Right. So it wasn't even as
they weren't just random. Right.
They weren't random, and they weren't. It wasn't even like, oh, these guys we don't know.
Right.
It was like, oh, this guy Robert Chambliss was so well known. He was known as Dynamite Bob, and it was kind of considered a joke.
Right.
And Bull Connor, the chieftain of City Hall for all these years, had protected him, and he was his snitch inside the Klan. So and the businesses in Birmingham protected Bull as long as he was good for business, and then he did start being bad for business. And then they got rid of him. Right. Yeah. So, vigilantes seem, as America knows from its record in the Middle East, vigilantes kind of, your guys seem like, your radicals seem like a good idea at the time, and they inevitably turn against you, because the climate that they create, is certainly in the case of the Klan in Birmingham, starts being bad for business once the economy shifts from heavy manufacturing to service. And so then, you've unleashed this force that you can't call back. Right. because they start believing in their infallibility, really. So that's what happened with the church bombing. So so I understand why Obama behaves the way he does, but I just say don't be intellectually dishonest, as was the case with Shirley Sherrod, you know, and then it's up to us to really say what it is. I was kind of surprised by, after his comments about Trayvon, how a lot of black commentators just were so furious about that. You know, do you have insight into that?
No, I don't.
Yeah. I think it was sort of like building up when he finally says something. Nothing could have been enough.
And,
right?
I think what the ongoing critique has been, particularly from folks who view themselves as progressives around the president race, is that whenever he has an opportunity, really to actually be the professor.
Yeah.
Right, like he did in the aftermath of Professor Gates's arrest. Right, and he stood there and he talked about racial profiling numbers, right? You know, what they looked like in Illinois when he was a state senator there. But what he's often done when he's had the opportunity to do that is lecture black folks about pathology.
Yeah.
As if they're the only people in the country,
Yeah.
you know, who have pathologies.
Yeah.
And if that's the totality of the story, is that the pathology itself isn't connected to these other larger narratives that people are trying to deal with.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And it's in the absence of lecture. This is what the point was about the Chicago police system and judicial system, is that if you're going to lecture about black pathology, lecture about social pathology.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined by Ms. Diane McWhorter, who is a fellow here at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University, where we're on location. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist for her book, Carry Me Home, which is about the civil rights movement in Alabama. Thank you for joining us, Diane.
Thank you, Mark.
All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black. All black, you know. All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black, everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, you know. Say all black, everything. All black, you know.